Along the long frontier of history, where empires rise like dawns and fall like storms, some defeats echo louder than victories, and some victories conceal a deeper fragility. There are times when the ground is soaked with blood and it seems certain that a great power has reached its end, and yet that power survives, heals, and grows stronger. There are other times when resistance collapses not at the edge of a battlefield, but at the heart of a civilization. When cities fall in such numbers, when authority shatters so completely that nothing coherent is left to rise. To understand why Rome endured Hannibal's genius and yet vast regions of the world crumbled beneath the hooves of Genghis Khan is to look beyond heroes and weapons into the hidden architecture of societies, into the ways states absorb shock or break apart when struck by a new kind of war. The Second Punic War began as a contest between two maritime powers, Rome and Carthage, for control of the Western Mediterranean, but it quickly became a deeper test of endurance. Carthage stood on the coast of North Africa, a city of merchants and shipyards, its wealth tied to trade routes and tributary territories in Spain and beyond. Rome sat further north, inland from the Italian coast, a republic of farmers and soldiers whose citizens had conquered the peninsula through stubborn campaigning and alliances with neighboring peoples. Carthage was ruled by a mercantile elite, balancing factions of great families whose unity was never guaranteed. Rome was ruled by a senate of aristocrats, but its political system had been forged in periods of crisis, with mechanisms for conscription, taxation, and replacement that reached deep into the countryside. Into this tension stepped Hannibal Barca, a commander schooled from childhood in hatred for Rome and in the art of war. He inherited from his father command in Spain, where Carthage had built a base of power after losing much of its older empire. With careful campaigns, he secured the loyalty of Iberian tribes and built an army that was not simply Carthaginian, but a mosaic of peoples, each with its own strengths. His decision to march overland into Italy, crossing the Pyrenees, the Rhone, and then the Alps, defied conventional logic. The mountain passes were treacherous, the weather lethal, the local tribes hostile. Men froze, slid, starved, and fell. Elephants, those exotic beasts brought as instruments of terror, stumbled on narrow ledges with snow swirling around them like ash. Yet the survivors who descended into the plains of northern Italy were hardened by a trial that itself became a weapon. They had walked through a world that Rome believed impassable. Their mere presence on Italian soil was a psychological shock. Once inside Italy, Hannibal revealed the full range of his tactical genius. At the river Trebbia, he lured Roman forces into a dawn attack, sending out his light infantry and cavalry as bait, drawing consular legions across an icy river in bitter cold. Wet, chilled, and hungry, the Romans advanced, believing in their superior numbers. Hidden near the crossing, in reeds and frost, Hannibal had concealed a picked force during the night, men lying motionless in the freezing dark as the river whispered beside them. When the Romans were fully engaged, this hidden unit emerged on their flank and rear, cutting off retreat. The river became a trap instead of a barrier. Bodies stumbled into the water, shields slipping from numb fingers. The defeat was not just physical, but mental, as Roman soldiers realized that the enemy commander had orchestrated their very movements before they rose from their camp beds. At Lake Trasimene, Hannibal used the landscape itself as a conspirator. He chose a narrow road between the lake and surrounding hills, positioned his men on the slopes, and waited behind a curtain of mist. As the Roman column stretched along the shore, burdened by baggage and constrained by terrain, he signaled the attack. From above, Carthaginian troops descended, the hillside exploding into life, while the lake blocked escape on the other side. The Roman army, taken in flank and rear, found itself compressed and disoriented. The fog turned the battlefield into a maze of shouts and glimpses, enemy shapes slashing in and vanishing. The Romans were not merely outnumbered or outmatched in force, they were outthought in 3 dimensions, in how they occupied space and how they conceived safety. A march that had seemed routine became a grave. The culmination of Hannibal's triumphs came at Cannae, on a flat plain where the hot Apulian wind swept dust into the air. Rome, determined to crush him, assembled what was perhaps the largest army it had ever fielded. Consuls and senators believed that sheer weight could finish what maneuver had not. They packed their infantry deep in the center, creating a massive column of men whose very density they trusted. Hannibal examined this army and saw not a wall, but a wedge he could pull and trap. He placed his weaker troops in the middle of his line in a slight forward curve. Stronger African infantry on their flanks, cavalry on the wings. When the Romans advanced, they drove into the bulging center, which slowly gave ground, bending backward. To Roman eyes, this looked like collapse. Their mass pressed forward, hungry for the rout they expected. But as the center yielded, the Carthaginian flanks pivoted inward, and the cavalry, having defeated their Roman counterparts, swept around to close the rear. The Roman army found itself surrounded on all sides, squeezed into a tightening ring of steel. Dying men could not even fall easily, crushed by the bodies of others. As the sun beat down and dust floated over piles of corpses, a shocking truth emerged. Rome's best forces had been broken, not by superior numbers or weapons, but by a mind that had turned their aggression and density into fatal weaknesses. By any ordinary measure, a state that suffered such defeats should have collapsed. Rome lost tens of thousands of trained soldiers, many members of its political elite, whole consular armies destroyed in the space of a few years. The psychological blow of Cannae, coming after earlier disasters, was immense. Villages and allied cities across Italy trembled. Some deserted Rome's cause, convinced that the future lay with the Carthaginian invader. Fields in the south lay blackened by war. The roads were dangerous. There were reasons to believe the Republic had reached the end of its road. Yet Rome did not die. In this lies the deeper explanation for why Hannibal's brilliance, while devastating, could not topple the Republic. Rome's strength was not only in its legions, but in its system. The Roman citizen body was large and accustomed to bearing arms. Service in the legions was not the privilege of a narrow caste, but, for much of the Republic, a duty and marker of status for wide layers of the free male population. Even after horrific losses, there remained reserves of manpower that could be mobilized. Conscription registers were updated. Boys just reaching fighting age were called up alongside older men. Entire property qualifications were adjusted so that poorer citizens could serve. The legions had been destroyed, but the mechanism to create more legions remained intact. Rome also had allies, the socii, communities across Italy bound by treaties that obligated them to provide troops. Some defected under the shock of Hannibal's victories, but many stayed. Others wavered and then decided that Rome was still the safer bet. Rome punished cities that abandoned it and protected those that remained loyal, using both stick and shield. The federated nature of the Italian system meant that even if some pieces broke, the whole structure did not immediately crumble. The Senate, despite defeats, continued to meet, debate, and issue orders. Its authority was shaken but not destroyed. There was no single royal figure whose death or capture could snap the spine of the state. Accompanied by deep arguments and political friction, the machinery of decision continued to turn. Perhaps most importantly, Rome adapted its strategy. After Cannae, a new approach emerged associated with the cautious general Fabius, who had earlier advocated avoiding pitched battle with Hannibal and was mocked as cowardly for doing so. Now, his logic gained force. Rome began to refuse the kind of engagements Hannibal wanted. Instead of offering another massive army to be encircled and annihilated, the Romans harassed his foraging parties, shadowed his movements, fortified key positions, and focused on recapturing or securing allies. They turned the war in Italy into a contest, not of one great decisive battle, but of endurance, attrition, and political persuasion. Hannibal could roam, burn, and win local victories, but he could not be everywhere at once. As he moved, Rome quietly rebuilt. There were moments when Rome sacrificed territory to save itself. Fields in southern Italy were sometimes abandoned. Populations withdrew behind walls or into safer regions, knowing that Hannibal could ravage the land but could not take Rome itself without siege equipment, sufficient reinforcements, or a reliable base near the city. The Republic accepted, bitterly, that parts of its heartland would become a kind of no man's land for a time. This was not cowardice, but a grim calculation. Better to lose harvests and towns than to lose the core institutions that allowed the state to raise and coordinate armies. While Hannibal remained in Italy, Carthage's political system failed to match Rome's resilience. The Carthaginian government was divided among factions, some suspicious of Hannibal's rising prestige, others reluctant to commit fully to his grand design. Carthage's citizen body was smaller, its military often built on mercenaries and allied contingents rather than a broad core of citizen soldiers. Its wealth was tied heavily to overseas possessions and trade, which Rome attacked methodically. Roman forces under other generals targeted Carthaginian holdings in Spain and later in North Africa itself, cutting off the roots of Hannibal's supply and recruitment base. While he was winning battles in Italy, the foundation beneath him was being slowly undermined. In the end, Hannibal stood as a commander unmatched on the battlefield, yet strategically isolated. He had shattered Roman legions at Trebbia, Trasimene, and Cannae, but he lacked the steady flow of reinforcements, the unified political backing, and the systemic depth that might have turned those victories into permanent dominance. Rome's ability to absorb defeat, to reform legions, to reconfigure strategy, to harness its alliances, and to sacrifice short-term safety for long-term survival allowed it to turn the tide. When Scipio eventually carried the war to Africa and confronted Hannibal at Zama, it was Rome that now combined tactical adaptation with strategic coherence. Carthage, bled of strength and divided, could no longer match Rome's capacity to wage war as a state. Where Rome survived Hannibal by virtue of its institutions and its social fabric, the world Genghis Khan attacked was, in many regions, far more fragile in the face of his kind of war. The Mongolian steppe, where he was born as Temujin, taught hardness of body and flexibility of mind. Tribes migrated with the seasons, following herds, reading the signs of grass and weather without maps. Rival clans raided and retaliated, making war a constant background condition rather than an extraordinary event. In this environment, those who survived were those who could think quickly, move fast, and forge bonds that outlasted betrayal. By uniting the Mongol and other tribes, reshaping them into a disciplined military society, Genghis Khan built more than a large army. He built a new kind of engine. Each mounted archer could ride for long distances, sustain himself on scant resources, and fight with deadly accuracy from horseback. But these warriors were not just scattered horsemen. They were organized into a system of units, with leaders chosen for ability rather than ancestry. Orders could travel rapidly along chains of command that had been purified of tribal rivalries. This allowed him to deploy his forces not as a mob, but as a fluid instrument, capable of enveloping enemies, of splitting forces and rejoining them, of coordinating attacks across hundreds of kilometers. When the Mongols turned outward, first against neighboring nomads and then against settled states, their strategy targeted far more than enemy armies. Against the Khwarezmian Empire, a prosperous realm of cities stretched along trade routes linking Persia, Central Asia, and beyond. The initial contact was diplomatic. A caravan and embassies were sent bearing goods and offers of trade. When a Khwarezmian governor seized and killed the merchants, and when envoys were also slain or mutilated, it was not merely an insult to national pride. It struck at the sanctity of communication, the arteries through which trust and commerce travel. Genghis Khan's response was total war. As his forces advanced, they did not simply seek out the main Khwarezmian army. They broke the empire into disconnected pieces. Columns moved in parallel, crossing deserts and mountains that defenders thought impassable. They seized key cities, often surrounding them so completely that no messenger could escape. They destroyed irrigation systems in some regions, turning fertile fields into dust, undermining the agricultural base that fed armies and urban populations. Where resistance was fierce or treacherous, massacres followed. City walls were leveled, populations were reduced or scattered. In such places, there was no reservoir of citizens to rebuild legions, no senate to convene, no network of allied communities waiting to answer a call. The Mongol campaign method acted like a corrosive on structures of authority. Kings fled, leaving their capitals without leadership. Local governors, faced with conflicting loyalties and terrifying stories of Mongol retribution, hesitated or submitted. Once the top layer of political authority cracked, There were often no deep-rooted institutions to hold the realm together. Unlike Rome, whose republican system had woven itself into the fabric of Italian communities over centuries, many of the Mongols' opponents were monarchies whose political life centered heavily on the person of the ruler and his immediate court. When that person fled or was killed, no resilient body stood ready to improvise. Panic spread faster than orders. Logistics, too, became a vulnerability for those facing Mongol invasions. Settled empires depended on stored grain, trade convoys, and river traffic to supply armies and cities. The Mongols, by moving rapidly and unpredictably, could cut supply lines, seize depots, and disrupt harvest cycles. In regions where they destroyed irrigation, failures of one season could cascade into famine. Populations that might have served as recruits for new armies were instead scattered or starved. Once an area had experienced such devastation, it could not quickly field fresh troops or repair fortifications. The depth of reserve that had saved Rome was simply not present in many of these lands. Psychological warfare was interwoven with these material attacks. The Mongols made sure that stories of their ruthlessness spread ahead of them. Word of entire cities destroyed, of survivors enslaved, of rulers executed, raced along roads and through caravansaries. Refugees carried tales of fire and slaughter into neighboring provinces. When Mongol envoys approached a city bearing demands for submission, local leaders had to weigh not only their own courage, but the likely response of their terrified populations. Some decided to resist regardless, hoping for divine intervention or underestimating reports. Others, faced with the prospect of total annihilation, opened their gates. In both cases, the Mongols achieved their aim. Resistance could be crushed and made an example. Surrender could be exploited to obtain supplies, intelligence, and additional troops without a prolonged siege. Unlike Hannibal, whose main theater remained Italy and whose state failed to fully exploit his battlefield victories, Genghis Khan commanded a system that could sustain multiple campaigns across different fronts. While one army was besieging a city, others were raiding, scouting, or negotiating elsewhere. The Mongol relay system, with its series of stations and fresh horses, allowed messages to cross enormous distances in surprisingly short times. Coordinated offensives became possible across vast regions. Enemy states, which might have hoped to form defensive coalitions, found themselves isolated by the speed and scope of Mongol operations. By the time news of one disaster reached a court, another was already unfolding. The civilizations Genghis Khan attacked were not uniformly fragile, but many were vulnerable to this kind of war. Their administrative systems were complex, yet often centralized around a single court. Their populations were concentrated in urban centers, which could be besieged, starved, and destroyed. Their economies depended on local ecological stability, on irrigation and trade routes that could be disrupted with enduring consequences. When these nodes were shattered, the surrounding countryside lost its organizing hubs. Refugees clogged roads, banditry rose, and surviving officials could not easily re-establish order. In some regions, Mongol conquest was followed by reconstruction and integration into a larger imperial system. In others, the initial devastation was so deep that recovery took generations or followed a different political path entirely. If Rome embodied a state designed for endurance, able to survive catastrophic defeats by drawing on its citizen base and its dense web of institutions, many of the Mongol victims embodied the opposite: brilliant centers without equally resilient peripheries. Hannibal's strategy operated in a world where, despite his genius, the large structures of power remained more or less intact. Roman roads still tied Italian communities together, the Senate still convened, consuls were elected, allied cities still fielded troops. Even when fields burned under Hannibal's raids, peasants could flee to other regions, and over time fields could be replanted. The damage was severe, but the underlying system was elastic. It bent without snapping. In the world of Genghis Khan, Mongol strategy aimed at snapping systems cleanly. Cities did not merely fall. Some vanished, their populations killed or deported, their wells filled, their walls dismantled. Trade hubs ceased to function, disrupting not only local economies but long-distance commerce. Entire regions emptied, either through death or flight. The demographic blow was not a temporary loss of armies, it was a thinning of society itself. In such an environment, there was no equivalent to Rome raising new legions after Cannae. The armature on which new forces could be built was gone. Hannibal's tactical brilliance stands in stark contrast with his strategic isolation. He could encircle Roman armies, he could lure them into traps, he could dominate the battlefield with a precision that left ancient observers awestruck. Yet he lacked what Genghis Khan possessed: a fully mobilized society behind him and an operational strategy that targeted the enemy's entire system. Carthage did not relentlessly push reinforcements, supplies, and coordinated offensives into Italy to support his work. Its political elites, wary of ramping up a total war that might threaten their own positions, hesitated and compromised. While Hannibal was writing masterpieces of tactical art in Apulia and Campania, Rome was reorganizing its alliances, attacking Carthaginian bases in Spain, building new fleets, and training new consuls to understand his methods. Hannibal's army was like a blade thrown deep into enemy flesh without the full weight of the body behind it. Genghis Khan, by contrast, wielded a weapon that was the body itself. His operational genius did not consist only in winning individual battles, though he did so repeatedly, but in structuring wars so that enemy systems could not regenerate. When a capital fell, it was not a single defeat on a list of engagements. It ripped out the administrative heart. When irrigation works were destroyed, it was not a temporary setback. It was the draining of lifeblood from agriculture. When cities that anchored trade networks were razed, their loss reconfigured economic patterns for decades. Conquest for him was not just about banners planted on walls, but about rewriting the map of human habitation and authority. In the contrast between Rome and the Khwarezmian Empire, between Italy and some of the Mongol devastated regions, one sees different kinds of resilience. Rome's society was used to mobilization. Its citizens considered military service a central part of their identity. Its political culture valued continuity even through crisis. It had mechanisms for absorbing new peoples into its system, granting varying degrees of rights, and moving them along paths of integration. The threat of annihilation evoked from Rome a deeper unity, even if it was strained and contested. The Senate, rather than collapsing, found ways to channel fear into policy. The old Republican structures, though under great pressure, proved strong enough to carry the weight. By contrast, many of the states that fell to the Mongols were not constructed to endure systemic shock on that scale. Their elites had not faced, in living memory, enemies who could bypass their fortified frontiers and attack deep in their interior quickly. Their communication lines were not built for rapid crisis coordination across their entire territories. Their concepts of war often revolved around defending frontiers, not surviving the destruction of core cities, and still maintaining coherent political identity. When Mongol armies appeared before their walls, these states responded with courage in many cases, but their efforts resembled Rome sending another army to face Hannibal without changing anything else. The difference was that, unlike Rome, they had fewer chances to learn. The blows came too hard and too fast. The psychology of the two struggles also diverged. In Italy, after the shock of Cannae, Rome slowly taught itself not to panic at the news of defeat. New armies were raised, vows were made to the gods, consuls rode out again. The Republic redefined victory in the short term as survival, as refusing to negotiate, as maintaining alliances. In the world of Genghis Khan, the psychological impact of Mongol terror was intensified by the speed with which news of massacres arrived. Governors and townspeople heard that a city much like their own had ceased to exist. This created a climate where fear could induce surrender even before a battle began, or where panic caused disorganized resistance that made defeat more likely. Instead of mobilizing a long-term defensive transformation, fear in many places led to fragmentation, distrust, and collapse. When Roman legions fell, their standards cast onto blood-soaked ground, their shields scattered, their bodies left in heaps, the Republic mourned and raged, but it had a system for responding. New recruits were mustered, existing legions were reinforced, commanders were brought to account or redeemed in later campaigns. In the years after Cannae, fields that had seen Roman dead became fields across which new legions marched. Villages that had emptied at the approach of Hannibal saw their inhabitants slowly return. Roads were repaired, taxes were levied again. The state had enough continuity to bind these cycles into a single story, a story of suffering but not of final ruin. In lands ravaged by the Mongols, empty battlefields were often not repopulated with new armies from the same state. They remained open or were grazed by horses from a new ruling group. Cities that once hummed with merchants and artisans sometimes lay silent, their ruins overgrown, survivors scattered elsewhere. The political bonds that had united those people under a single realm were cut. New powers would later arise, but they often did so within a landscape permanently altered by the Mongol impact. Where Rome could send envoys to communities that had fought beside it for generations and call them again to arms, many Mongol victims lacked such webs of solidarity to draw upon. Their internal coherence had been dissolved. In the end, Rome survived Hannibal because it was more than any single army or general. Its identity ran deeper than the legions annihilated on a given day. Its institutions, its alliances, its capacity to organize and reorganize made it capable of learning from defeat. Hannibal's victories were tactical masterpieces set against a resilient, strategic canvas. Genghis Khan's conquests, by contrast, often hit societies whose strategic canvas could be torn apart. His strategy did not leave room for slow adaptation in those he targeted. He struck not only where they were militarily unprepared, but where their systems were least able to withstand the combined assaults of mobility, terror, and disruption. Conquest, then, is decided not only by the brilliance of those who lead armies, but by the worlds they attack and defend. A genius can win battles and still lose a war if his own state is hesitant and fragile, if his victories are not fed by a deep reservoir of support. Another genius can shatter whole civilizations if his methods aim beyond the battlefield, if he forces enemy systems past the point of self-repair. Rome and Hannibal, Genghis Khan and his scattered foes remind us that beneath the banners and the dust clouds lies the hidden skeleton of institutions, loyalties, and ways of life. When that skeleton is strong and flexible, it can absorb even the heaviest blows. When it is brittle, a single prolonged storm can turn an entire world to rubble. The plains where Roman blood once darkened the soil are quiet now, their grasses hiding the memory of broken shields. The steppes and deserts where Mongol horses once thundered still feel the wind tugging at the grass and sand as it did centuries ago. Yet in war colleges and history books, in quiet studies and whispered conversations about power, the same question returns. Why did Rome live while others died? The answer, glimpsed through the stories of Hannibal and Genghis Khan, is that conquest is never only about the genius of one man. It is about the strength or fragility of the systems his genius touches, about whether a society can stand back up when the dust settles, or whether, when the storm passes, there is simply nothing left to rise.